Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 17 of the Mind Blown Zone. This one is called The Meaning of Consciousness. Here with Brad. How you doing, Brad?
Never better as usual. And yourself?
Great as always.
Awesome.
You excited about this one?
I am. I wanted to get this one out into the wild so that we can refer back to it if need be. And it's an important topic that doesn't get enough coverage in my book.
Yep. The word consciousness is just kind of, oh yeah, consciousness. I'll just throw that word around however I like.
It's like
Okay,
narcissist.
Yeah, just a word. Yeah, I heard it somewhere. I'll throw it around. Okay, so let me do the intro. So in this podcast, we're examining two radically different worldviews of consciousness. Those are the material and the spiritual worldviews. We'll be starting with the materialist view, looking at the value of it, and then presenting some spiritual understandings. Then we'll be offering in amongst that, we'll be offering a critique of the materialist worldview. And we're actually going to get to something pretty interesting at the end. We're going to look at this David Hawkins map of consciousness. Gonna be really exciting. All right. You want to launch into it, Brad, with the materialist worldview?
Oh, sure. I guess I'll do this first section here. So we pulled a few dictionary definitions of this word consciousness. And the first one I liked particularly only because I'll be differentiating between some of the words they actually use to define it. It's always, there's always a little bit of a problem when one of the essential words, or the root of the word is part of the definition. But the dictionary.com says consciousness is the state of being conscious, awareness of one's own existence, sensations, thoughts, surroundings, etc. So
Right.
that's dictionaries. Wikipedia says at its simplest, consciousness is awareness of internal and external existence.
So they've basically said in Wikipedia, consciousness equals awareness.
As essentially dictionary does as well, right? Awareness of one's own existence. So the two words are synonymous in effect.
Right. Conscious, synonymous with consciousness, and it's basically awareness, consciousness, conscious, being conscious, all the same thing so far.
Yeah, I think conscious is a quality of consciousness, right? But without that quality, well, we'll dive into it a little later here. Webster's 1828. What do they say? The knowledge of sensations and mental operations, or of what passes in one's own mind, the act of the mind which makes known an internal object. It's kind of an interesting definition, isn't it?
Yep. So I would say that all three definitions, you're kind of like just say you really wanted to know what consciousness was, and then you read those definitions, you'd be like, yeah, but what is it?
Right? It leaves a little bit to be desired. What do the academics have to say about this interesting word?
Sure. Two interesting words come up when you start to look at the academic explanation. Epiphenomenalism. So this concept is a position on the mind-body problem, which holds that physical and biochemical events within the human body are the sole cause of mental events. So, the materialist view of consciousness is, well, you had the Big Bang, and then the universe formed, and then the earth formed, and then life formed out of pond scum, and then miraculously evolved, and then consciousness happened, which leads to the second thing, which is emergentism, right? So they say that consciousness emerged, right? So emergentism is belief in emergence, particularly as it involves consciousness and the philosophy of the mind, right? So they basically say that consciousness is an emergent property of the material world, right? So that's why I said Big Bang, Earth, evolution, and then somehow consciousness emerged out of the material. A whole bunch of biochemical and physical events and magic consciousness. It sounds pretty legit, right, Brad?
Yeah, it's. I'm not going to say anything. Let's keep going.
Well, you have to say something because the next thing is the materialist critique. So we have emergent phenomenon critique. So do you want to go through some of this?
Yeah, so that it leads into it. I mean, all those definitions lead to so many questions. It's almost mind-boggling, right? I don't even know where to start, but I guess we will start right here, where we say this, this emergent phenomenon critique, right? The intelligence that is doing everything is happening because of the highly fortunate interactions of random chemicals. That's the only conclusion you can draw. Right? Somehow or another, these elements and chemicals mixed together and formed what we now think of as ourself. That's the logical conclusion. So somehow you can get a bunch of atoms together and they'll do these amazing, brilliant things, which are the things that you and I do, right? Like wake up in the morning and
all
go
by
to the
chance.
bathroom. It's all random chance that this all came together. And, if it's funny because if there wasn't this thing, this emerging property called consciousness, then nothing would be going on except just rocks and water and stuff floating around, right? There'd be nothing happening without it.
Well, materialists draw on the anthropic principles here. And they say, well, the universe is infinite, as proven by science, it's just infinite. We live in the observable universe. And, just in an infinite universe, everything can happen. And we just happen to live in the locality of the universe where this thing called consciousness emerged. And that's why everything makes sense. There are other places in the universe where it's just rocks and nothing, but we happen to live here, and that's why we can look at it.
It's fascinating. That's all I'll say. It's it's as if the things that really matter are the material, and that's all we really need to be focused on, right? The body, for example, made out of stuff, and then the thing that animates the body and makes the body worth having and living through is this secondary accumulation of bouncing chemicals. Just happens to make it all work. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's just like something that came out of the material, right? The material is the primary. Consciousness is some fortunate or just chance secondary that arose out of the material.
Right. Can't touch it, measure it, see it, feel it. And there's just no other logical explanation but interacting chemicals. Yeah?
Right.
Interesting.
By chance.
Yeah, random chance. Yeah. This is my thing I always like to talk about. So I think a lot of times that you'll hear this idea known as the autonomic nervous system in medical texts or biology texts and so forth, anatomy, which effectively is this thing that has its own consciousness somehow. It's different from my waking consciousness, and it manages to do everything my body needs to have done. But the only thing it can't do is eat and go to the bathroom. Those are the only two requirements it has of my waking consciousness. It can handle all the rest. It manages to turn all that food into fuel and power and makes my cells and my tissues and anything that's not good, it gets rid of. And pretty smart little thing there. But that's happening via some form of consciousness, isn't it?
Right. I mean, yeah, like you would think that it's happening by some form of consciousness. And unfortunately, that we have the materialists saying it is the autonomic nervous system is a chance emergent phenomenon that has arisen from millions of years of evolution of genes and RNA and DNA and have miraculously formed into this autonomic nervous system, which runs a body that a consciousness can arise out of.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating that there's no evidence that any of this works in any way. Like I'm sure there are hundreds or thousands of researchers who have tried to mix some chemicals, some elements, and zap it with some electricity, and come up with all different types of formulations. to try to spark this thing called consciousness into their, soups, right?
Right.
And to date, I'm not aware of anybody pulling anything off along those lines. Are you?
Nope. It's pretty funny that the materialists are so certain that consciousness arose out of the material. Um, but they can't use their science to create consciousness. So clearly consciousness is beyond them. And when consciousness comes back at them and says and disagrees with them, they're like, oh no, you're silly. Oh no, consciousness, you're silly. It's all material.
Right. Yeah. At what point do you abandon the theory or look at what people have been saying for thousands of years? That's the real question.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I think the answer to that is never. They can never do that.
No, they can only laugh at it. Right.
Yeah. Dismiss
At
it.
how ridiculous it is. Like, thousands of years of people saying that consciousness is something special, something, some sort of primary, right? And to suggest that to a materialist is like, what an absurdity.
It is indeed. It's a heavy dose of a river in Egypt. I guess with this next point here, we were talking about morality, of course. Isn't it strange that random interactions of quanta build into you a sense of right and wrong too? So somehow or another, we have this innate sense of morality that comes from this random mix of chemicals. Additionally,
Right. Right.
fascinating.
So, well, random quantum interactions created many beings that have a sense of right and wrong and a sense of purpose, and it all just happened by chance.
I added this little section here, and it just this primordial soup idea has had legs for over 100 years now, and it's in all the biology textbooks, and it's never gone anywhere. But if you go and look at how this thing got started, there was a guy named JBS Haldane in the 1920s, and he he mixed some oil and water, which it shouldn't be too fascinating of a thing, and watched them separate into their own little globules, and thought, well, this is how it got started. And he actually called it the primordial soup. So this,
Right.
the early conditions of after the earth cooled, this is how it would have gotten done. And that's where that word came from, or that phrase, primordial soup. And then this guy named Harold Urey in the 50s came along and thought, I think the original, he doesn't have any proof of this or evidence of this, but he just decided that the original primary elements on the cooling Earth, which he also has no proof of, were methane and hydrogen. And so he started doing some zapping of these elements and produced, with some electricity, and he produced some, basic amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, obviously. And that kind of revivified the primordial soup idea, which died until a lot of other scientists got a hold of it and said, oh yeah, that's pretty commonplace, and we see that all the time. So it's just a natural process in nature that certain elements combine to form amino acids under certain conditions. There's nothing surprising or unique about it. And, as far as we're aware, new forms of consciousness aren't arising all over the place due to these interactions.
Right.
This is the pond scum primordial soup idea. It comes basically from these two guys. So in both cases, right? In both cases, it was quickly shown that there was nothing special about what either one had done, but their idea had got, people took hold of this idea, and it's still the prevailing, theory out there anytime we talk about how life emerged on Earth.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty funny.
We've seen this before in other talks we've done, but we'll not talk about those today. But yeah, there's nothing impressive about what either of these two guys did, and it doesn't even come close to demonstrating this is how life or consciousness got going on Earth.
Right. Okay.
So there we have it. What's next?
So yeah, this is kind of like the science's understanding of consciousness, right? It kind of like doesn't lead you anywhere, doesn't give you any value, and holds this total absurdity that it just basically emerged out of the Big Bang and primordial soup, and that's where everything came from. And we just think it's a little strange for that to be your first belief, right? To stick with that and hold that as a belief is a bit strange, right?
Right.
And it's going to lead you with a lot of questions. Like you're going to be like, well, what's consciousness, right? So do you want to go into this, Brad, about
Sure,
this
sure.
consciousness being, the mainstream idea that emerges out of all the stuff that we've talked so far is to be conscious equals to be aware, right? That's where it lands you. But we want to bring in some new stuff. So go into it, Brad.
So yeah, just quickly to back up, not to completely, the mainstream academic scientists talk a lot about a lot of interesting subjects about what consciousness is, right? They've evaluated it and they look at it and it's very, mysterious and they don't understand it. And, it leads to, where does love come from? And why do we get hungry? There's a lot of interesting things that they talk about. So it's not to completely take away from it, but as soon as they hit this wall of the chemical wall, I'll call it,
Mm-hmm.
they it would seem like they would be interested in expanding out a little bit, and I think some have. Right, there are several academic scientists who have branched into where we're headed in this podcast. Donald
Mm-hmm.
Hoffman being the one who's most noteworthy. So that there are some, but I think what it comes down to is it's they can't find funding, they can't find grants, they may they may not get promoted, they may not get tenure, they may get blackballed out of their profession. There's a lot of risks to them branching into where we're going to be heading with this talk today. So in fairness to them, they seem to be yoked and censored in a way that they have to stick with the chemical idea. Some of them,
Mm-hmm.
maybe most of them, I don't know. Anyway,
Right.
so this idea, right? This, obviously, conscious is the root of consciousness, and so they seem like they're one and the same. And so the kind of the mainstream idea we have here is the state of being consciousness is that your outer ego mind is awake and aware. It's online, right? So there's some association with that being conscious, like that's consciousness when you're awake. So
Mm-hmm.
when you go to sleep or you get knocked unconscious, right now you've lost your consciousness, right? You're now unconscious
Right.
when you're sleeping. So so the indication is that you lack consciousness when you're knocked out or sleeping, right? That's the
Right.
implication when you use those words that way. But at the same time, we all know that your body is fully conscious while you're sleeping, right? It's able to keep breathing and keep the heart beating and digesting and whatever it does while you're sleeping. So there's some form of consciousness. I mean, at this point, we almost have to take the word consciousness and make it synonymous with intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because something intelligent is going on while you're out cold.
Right.
And of course, the fallback is this idea. It's the autonomic nervous system, which is beyond intelligent. It's beyond our intelligence, right? We can't do as men what the autonomic nervous system does for us. So it's actually more intelligent than us when you get right down to it.
Right.
But
But
my
materialists say that
suggestion,
the automatic, if I can just add, the
go ahead.
materialists say the autonomic nervous system is just like this, ongoing interaction of chemicals and physics, right? Not
Yeah,
consciousness, nothing spiritual, nothing primary, just molecules interacting with each other.
right. Molecules that haven't been proven to exist. Yeah, it's just metabolic processes is what what they say, right?
Right.
And we'll get into some deeper aspects of this in a moment here. But so yeah, I got that implication in there, right? This when you're asleep, you're unconscious or you lack consciousness. Now some don't say that because we'll get right to this spot here where we say you have dreams while you're quote unquote unconscious, right? We've all had weird dreams, and nightmares, and great dreams, and who knows, all different types. While we appear to lack consciousness, so something is having those dreams, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Some form of consciousness is having those dreams. Anyway, it sets up a lot of problems and it should be clear that consciousness does not equal being conscious. I think that was the point we were trying to make here, right?
Yeah, I think what we're saying is the most mainstream theory points to, like, leads you to this place that consciousness is this thing where you're awake and aware, right? You're conscious of the stuff around you.
All right.
But
I
then
think
that just puts you in another problem, and you're like, but what? Yeah, and then what?
right. You may not be conscious of what's outside of you while you're sleeping, but you're definitely conscious of what's inside of you. And that was an earlier definition. So that, I think that came from the Wikipedia definition. But I think what they meant there was your thoughts and feelings. That's, you're conscious of your thoughts and feelings. But what about your dreams?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we hit that next bullet there. I'm not sure about the next one either.
Well, I think it's this point about having consciousness.
Yeah,
Right?
that's the next place to
All
go here,
this,
right?
the way it's spoken about and the way the science is done is that the general core mainstream position is that consciousness is something that your body has or doesn't have.
Right.
Right?
That's the key. That's the key thing to understand here is and you'll see the reverse of it when we talk about the spiritual side of things, but that's the materialist view, is that I have consciousness.
And you are your body and your ego.
Right.
And you have consciousness.
This body mind structure has consciousness. That's right.
Right.
And somehow or another, the combination of this mind and this body, this matter, and the mind is the brain also, right? That is the extent of the mind in the materialist worldview. It's the white matter and gray matter with chemicals bouncing around. Constitutes the entirety of the mind. Has to, and that somehow out of that comes consciousness that I have. Okay, so yeah, I guess that the next point I jumped to, I got Hoffman down here, but yeah, we run into this kind of same situation like Hubble and Einstein and others in other topics that under no circumstances can there be any possibility of any other explanation of a spiritual metaphysical nature, right?
We
can't look there.
Right.
So yeah, I mentioned Hoffman right here. He's been in some interesting discussions, podcasts over the last few years. I know he went through some pretty serious health problem a year or two ago that he just came out of a couple months ago. But he's one of these guys that at least is interested in talking about the spiritual aspect of things. I think he realizes they've hit a wall, and and if they don't go in the spiritual direction, then there's nothing left, right? They just keep hitting black holes and walls, with all their attempts to associate it consciousness with chemicals. So interesting guy to listen to. What did we say about Einstein here?
Oh, this
is yours. Yeah, this is yours. Yeah.
All right, I'll just read it off. So in academia, you can say anything you want as long as it doesn't drive people towards spirituality. And you get bonus points if it drives people further into materialism and further away from spirituality. For example, Einstein, he's like, oh yeah, general relativity. It's like, oh, I got something that will put people 100 years into materialism and away from spirituality. So it's the Kabbalah is like, oh, amazing. Let's prop this guy up, get his theory all over the place. It gives a beautiful materialistic explanation of the world that's going to take him 100 years or more to see the faults in.
About right. That's about exactly right. That seems to be what's going on. That's certainly it's actually exactly what's going on from our point of view. But we just want to get it out there and see what other people think. What do we got next here?
Well, we're getting into the spiritual, and you want to raise some questions here.
Let's see what we're asking here. Yeah. So this is the big question. And we're just flipping everything on its head, suggesting perhaps our mainstream establishment ideas are the inversion of reality. So the question would be, what if consciousness wasn't something you had, but it was actually something that you are? And that something that you are had a body and a mind. What do you think? Crazy?
Yeah, well, it's I think everything that we presently accept as true, we need to begin asking, what if not that, but the reverse?
Right? The exact reverse, 180-degree
Exact
inversion,
reverse.
right?
Right.
Right. If that's true, right? If we really are a body mind that, uh, if we really are consciousness that has the body mind, then where does that lead, right? What that leads us in the direction of some metaphysical explanations here. So you could call this thing consciousness. You could call it your soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or your essence, or your higher self, your inner being, your inner self, your psyche, even subconscious mind is something that mainstream, certainly psychology, acknowledges. And I think mainstream science acknowledges it as well. It's the mind beneath your conscious mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
In spiritual circles, you'll hear certain people talk about this, whatever this is, this consciousness, this soul, essence, psyche. They'll call it the larger part of you, the very, very larger part of you. So that's an interesting little take. Anything you wanted to add in that section there, Matt?
Um, yeah, well, it's generally, yeah, all these terms, subconscious mind, psyche, inner self, they're kind of like these like, oh, these like silly things that philosophers and spiritual people talk about, right?
Well, yeah, I think they acknowledge the subconscious mind, right? That would be acknowledged by the materialists as a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Most people recognize, like the idea of the smoker who can't quit, and then they get the hypnosis, and that's pretty provable that can be done with certain people. So there is some acknowledgement there, but it's ignored for the most part as having anything whatsoever to do with this bigger question of consciousness.
Right. And,
Would you agree?
they would talk about how we can do behaviors and do what they call conscious activities to reprogram the subconscious mind. Like, and then they bring in like a materialist explanation of that, which is like change your neurology, right? So you're like doing these things and it's rewiring your brain. And then because you rewire your brain, your subconscious mind changes.
Right. Right. They always want to bring it back to one thing. It's just the white matter and the gray matter. It's just two different emanations of it.
Mm-hmm.
Something along those lines. So yeah, so we jump into the Indian yogis here, right? These guys, you go back 5,000 years, and they're talking about four states of consciousness. I won't. I'm not going to use the Indian terms here, but they have this awake state, this deep sleep state, the REM state, and then they have the higher awareness state. Now this will push everyone to the edge here, but this they suggest that when you reach their level of consciousness, that they can rise up out of the body and look at their body lying on the bed, or go off and do different things. And some people have probably heard of these ideas called OOBs, or out of body experiences, which is consciously, while you're awake, consciously going outside the body through the silver cord. Some people call it astral travel. So this is something that doesn't fit into the materialist paradigm at all. There's no explanation for this, so it has to be kind of written off as hallucination or deception or something. But that state's called Turiya, by the way. They call it transcendental consciousness. So what do you think about
Mm-hmm.
that, Matt? Crazy talk?
Well, anyone such as myself who has had plenty, let's say, of psychedelic experiences knows that this stuff is, you know, as close a thing to real as you want to apply the label.
Pretty interesting, huh?
I mean, someone like your Neil deGrasse Tysons and your, all those uh, pop physicists and stuff like that. Those type of people, right? They want to say, oh, that's just you put the chemicals in there and it goes into the brain and it magically by some biochemical process that we don't fully understand yet, but science is getting closer to understanding, creates these hallucinations. Like,
Right.
yeah, okay, that's fantastic, bro. Or it's just, it simply is just that way. And
It's
it's not just by chance materialism equations.
it's easy for them to explain that with drug usage, right? That you can't fault them for going in that direction, but to be in your totally natural state, right, of consciousness without any drugs in the mix, how these people can astral travel, or the Indian yogis
Right,
can
right, right.
leave
Sure.
the body. They don't have an explanation for it, and because they don't have an explanation for it, they ignore it. Right?
Right.
It just has to be. Don't talk about that 5,000-year-old thing that these guys have been talking about. We're on the cutting edge of science. Let's
Mm-hmm.
ignore that stuff. So yeah, so who's next here? We've got my good friend Steiner. So I'm not sure where that word came from here, but I'm going to skip over that.
Well, it
But
was the deep sleep state name, the Indian
I
name.
gotcha. Yeah. So Steiner suggests that when you go into deep sleep, you're he talks about we don't have time to go into it, but he talks about different bodies: etheric body, astral body, physical body, the I complex. But the etheric body is where your emotions emanate from, according to anthroposophy. And he suggests that when you fall into deep sleep, your that part of you that manages your emotions exits your body. So it's just not there. It's out doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you don't need to move around, itch yourself, and you just have no memory of that, sweet 6, 7, 8 hours of sleep that you get. That part of you that's recording that information isn't attached to the physical body during that time. And it basically goes off into the spiritual realms. We'll dive into what Mulford says about that a little bit here. But that's why you don't have any thought, memory, or any, time doesn't exist when that part of your body, that etheric body, is not with you. But that doesn't mean there's no consciousness there, right? Because there is, because you're still digesting, breathing, heartbeat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the Steiner explanation. Prentice Mulford, one of my all-time favorites, suggests that the only reason we need to sleep is because we are depleting our power all day long by sending our astral body and etheric bodies, which is our memories and emotions, off into the past and the future. We're not keeping
Mm-hmm.
it focused here in this now moment. So the more you do that, the more sleep that you need. The less present you are, the more sleep you need. So kind of think of someone with kind of scattered thoughts, scattered awareness. They're just, oh, look at this. And they're telling you a story for 10 seconds. And then they're talking about something else in 10 seconds, right? And they're just jumping all over the place. This would be the scattering that he talks about. So he mirrors what Steiner said. In fact, he was talking about this stuff maybe 10 or 20 years earlier than Steiner. So they weren't collaborating. They didn't know about each other, yet they arrive at the same type of conclusion, at least about the etheric body.
Right.
So that's when you go to a memory, say, what was the name of your teacher and your English teacher in 12th grade, right? You have to go send off your astral body to go retrieve that bit of information. So that would be an example, right? You have to think about who was your English teacher in 12th grade.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Just thinking about you know, uh, you know, drinking coffee, right? So when the materialists talk about drinking coffee, they say it's because the caffeine has a molecular effect on certain chemicals in your body, like your sleep chemical and your awake chemical, and does something to them. And then that means that now you need more sleep because of the effect that it has had molecularly. I kind of see coffee these days as an amplifier. And, you know, I know some people, my father, for example, who he can drink coffee at 7 p.m. Doesn't make him miss out on any sleep. So if you take someone who's, constantly obsessing about past and present, past and future, and as you say here from Prentice Mulford, taking the astral and etheric body out of the present, that would indicate that, you drink some coffee and then you're like doing this more, right? It's amplified. So then you need more sleep because you've done that more. But if someone's just generally present and they drink coffee, it doesn't really increase it much at all. So it doesn't make them need more sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about this in the past. Yeah, it's I still have a little bit of that. I think some beliefs fit into that a little bit as well. But
mm-hmm.
Yeah, the suggestion from the highest masters say you don't need any sleep at all if you've reached a certain degree of consciousness.
Right.
Not required. You're resting your muscles and your bones when you're sitting and laying and so forth, but you don't need to actually close your eyes and drift off. Your astral and etheric bodies don't need to recuperate anything, so it's not required. Interesting. Anyway, I like those two guys just because they come up with similar ideas, yet they knew nothing about each other, and it's relatively non woo woo-ish, a little bit of woo woo in there for some people, but nonetheless, it's experience has taught me that what they're talking about is accurate. Right? If I have a more focused day, the mind isn't wandering and so forth, I tend to need less sleep. When I have a hectic day, I tend to need more sleep.
Right. Yeah. When I have horrible negative emotions, and go crazy, like the next day I'm like, oh, so I haven't had enough sleep,
Right. So that kind of brings us to conscious, subconscious now. We'll make a little distinction here that this conscious mind is, we can pull this from Steiner, Mulford, and hundreds of others, is the mind that's beholden to the five senses. That's our conscious or our ego mind.
Brad, would you mind when you say these things, can you say it with the thing that people call? I just think it makes a lot more sense.
Okay. The thing that people call the conscious mind is the programmed mind. That's the thing that's beholden to the outer five senses, sight, smell, sound, touch, taste. That's what it is exclusively. That's exclusively its domain. And then the subconscious mind, the thing that people call the subconscious mind, is the psyche, the soul, the essence, the higher self, or the larger part of you. So it seems to be behind the scenes, right? Doesn't make itself known. And that's of course ego and id from Freud. Right? He's also acknowledging these two different minds. And then the superconscious, I think that the thing that people call the superconscious mind is this higher mind that you may have heard people talk about. If you've studied some spirituality, people would call this awareness, or biblically they might call this the witnessing mind. So it seems to be outside of the domain of the five senses. Hard to describe, hard to explain to someone who hasn't sat in it. Most of us have sat in it accidentally at times, but you seem to be looking at things rather than analyzing and evaluating things. It's an interesting perspective. Anyway, that's the conscious subconscious thing. Is that making
Yeah,
a
I
little
would
bit of
say,
sense?
yeah, I mean, just the super conscious mind. I think it's the easiest way to understand it is just like, if you're having your thoughts, you're thinking, 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 and then suddenly you go, oh, wait, I am not my thoughts. And then you feel like you're watching your thoughts. That's when you know that the
Right.
higher self is operating.
Right. We
The
slip into it
awareness
at
is here.
times. Right. We'll slip into it when you think about something you screwed up. Usually it's when we screw something up and you start evaluating yourself. I shouldn't have said that to her last night. I was, that was dumb or whatever,
Mm,
right? And you're starting to observe what you at a higher level what the ego mind did. It's not totally what's being talked about here, but that's kind of gives people a
hmm.
flavor for it, right?
Right.
There's a phrase, be in this world, but not of it. And, that's hard to grasp, but that's the suggestion here is that we're slipping into this super conscious mind and it's more like neutral observation. We're not calling everything good and bad, right and wrong, et cetera, et cetera. We're just kind of watching everything play out in front of us. Interesting space to
Yeah,
be.
but it's a crazy experience because like when that part of you is like slipping into the present, and I might be watching myself like have some argument, and I'm like saying things, and I'm like as I'm saying them, I'm like, what I'm saying right now is so ridiculous and ego driven. Right. So I'm
Right.
like watching myself saying it. I'm like watching my emotions. I'm like, I cannot believe that I am doing this right now.
Right.
This is so absurd.
Right.
I should totally stop. And I just keep doing it. I'm like, why aren't I stopping? This is so
Right.
absurd. And then I'm
Right.
like, and now I'm like another level up. I'm like judging myself for even doing it. But the awareness is there. It just really points to there being these, distinct uh parts, let's say, of consciousness operating.
Right. That's exactly right. And it's nice to, when you catch the awareness of that, it's nice that, you can see it. All the spiritual masters out there will suggest that that is actually our natural state is to be in
Hmm.
that position. But we've been well indoctrinated into not taking that position.
Hmm.
Anyway, we got next the body. So this, of course, the spiritual side of things suggests that the body itself emerges from consciousness. So the emergent property from the spiritual point of view is that the material,
Hmm.
which is our body, emerges via the intelligence, the power of consciousness. So
Right.
naturally, it's the reverse of what the academia world would suggest.
Right.
Uh,
And that can be confusing because if you say like if you hold in your head like the mainstream definition, right, of consciousness, you're like, consciousness is the state of being conscious, or consciousness is the emergent phenomenon created by material, all right? And then you say, and then someone says to you, the body emerges from consciousness. Well, that's a complete contradiction, right? So I would say the way to comprehend this is to go, okay, let's start with an idea. The body emerges from consciousness, and say, okay, maybe I don't know, maybe that is true. And then ask, what would consciousness have to be, and how would consciousness work, and what would the properties of it? What would consciousness be all about for the body to emerge from consciousness? And that'll send you down an interesting path.
mm-hmm, right. You can go back to the sperm meeting the egg idea. Like, how does that? What is it that gets that whole process rocking, right? And then once you think you flesh that one out, you start getting into the chicken and the egg problem, which
Mm-hmm.
came first.
Right.
And there's no good answers that you can arrive at, but uh, get you thinking in a few different ways for sure. What do we got next here? Muscle memory. Yeah, this is something I like to just point out to people is that, let's say you get really good at, golf or football or baseball or piano or whatever. You develop a skill, right? For the first X number of weeks, months, or years, you had to think about how you threw the ball or how you played the notes and played the scales. But then eventually, you don't have to think about any of it anymore. It's all what they call muscle memory. It's a convenient little term, isn't it?
Yes. It's now
Michael
down to
Jordan,
the automatic, right? It's the autonomic nervous system has learned it, right?
right? All that hard work you had to do to think about it and try it and get good at it. And now it's just all, you can just pass it all over to the autonomic nervous system. It's got it all locked up for you. Don't even think about it anymore.
The chemicals have learned the habit, right? By doing it so many times.
Right? Doesn't matter what you have for breakfast, those chemicals will be there for you to make you be able to jump from the foul line and fly through the air and slam the basketball anytime you need it. You figured out how to do it. Your muscles got your back. So that would, of course, imply that there's some form of consciousness in your muscles. It's more autonomic nervous system, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's going on here is like people say that you have to consciously do it first, right? You need to ego it, you need to effort it, you need to focus on it. That's you consciously doing it. And after you've done that enough, then it becomes unconscious. And as we've said before, you need to, going forward, people need to start asking, what if stuff that the mainstream accepts is completely in reverse? So what you're suggesting, Brad, is that when it becomes this automatic way, that's when consciousness is doing it. That you're in a, that, and I guess you would even suggest, Brad, that consciousness can always do it, and you didn't have to
Right.
learn it.
Right. That's right.
You've allowed consciousness to take over rather than resisting it, right?
Right. Right. Your subconscious mind allowed you the luxury of working hard and training to get good at it, but it could have done it for you from the get
Right.
go.
You just needed to convince yourself that you could do it so
Have you
that
ever,
you reach a point where you say, I can do it.
have you ever, are you a golfer? Have you ever played a little
No,
golf?
I'm interested though. I'm interested.
I'll just tell you the quickest of quick stories is that one summer I decided I'd give it a go and work hard at it, and got considerably better, I would say, through the course of the summer until the end of the summer. And by this point, I had 30 or 40 private lessons, and I was going out 3, 4, 5 days a week, playing 18 holes and progressing. And then it got to the fall, and at this point, I had learned 84 different tips on how my hands and wrists and hips and knees and all the different little things. And one day, I just things weren't working well, and next thing you know, I'm trying to figure out where the problem is, and by the third hole, I couldn't even hit the ball 20 yards.
Right.
I had completely fallen apart because I was thinking about my golf swing, like every aspect of it.
Right.
So it was kind of that out of the zone thing versus the in the zone means you're just allowing the subconscious to run the show and do everything. And that's when you're in the zone. And out of the zones when you're up in your head thinking about how to do things.
Right.
So a little sports metaphor.
Well, it's the classic story of the centipede. I think there's a frog maybe, and it says to the centipede, how do you control all those legs? Get them all moving in perfect harmony. Like, how do you do that? Centipede's like, I never really thought about that. I wonder how I do that. it sits on the side of the road for a while and thinks about how it does it. And the next thing, it can't even walk. It's like, how do I put this leg in front of the? And actually, a lot of people's pain in their body comes from like these conflicts over how the movement works. Like they start to intellectualize the movement, and they want to overly control it and they want to move the body how I think the body moves, and that creates so much stiffness and tightness and paralyzes you. You got to completely let go and just let it happen.
That's exactly right. I was just in that golf metaphor. There was a golfer 30, 40 years ago who was I can't remember his full name, but he was, one of the, I think he was like top 3 in the world for like 5 or 6 years. And all of a sudden he wasn't putting as well as he used to. And he started sliding down because, obviously you putt for dough, right? Drive for show, putt for dough. And he got it up into his head, and his game just completely fell apart. He wasn't even in the top 500 like a year later. Couldn't putt anymore. Could not make a putt. And that's just a good example of he had it all and had it all working smoothly for years, and then got in his head. He was not one with the ball, as the Zen master might suggest.
Right.
All right, so that's muscle memory. We spent a lot of time on that one. What do we got next here? Oh yeah, the big one.
Awareness.
Yeah.
So what's awareness, Brad?
Well, I think I alluded in the earlier part that the mainstream idea makes this word synonymous with consciousness, and I don't think so. I separate it, and some spiritual people don't, and it doesn't need to be separated, but then again, it does. And of course, what I'm suggesting here is that consciousness is the material aspect of things. It's operating the material, but you can take a step back into a different position, and you can see the material operating. And so that's what the out of body and astral travel idea is about. We'll get to NDEs here in a second. But that's what this is suggesting, is that there's something that can observe consciousness.
So to just clarify with you, you're saying that consciousness operates the material?
Right.
And creates the material, or plays a role in creating the material?
It is the material.
Consciousness is the material. Okay.
Yeah.
It takes it even another level deeper.
Right. We're not going to talk about rocks in this one, but the suggestion is that even rocks have consciousness, just a different type of consciousness, right?
Well, not have consciousness, but are consciousness.
Oh, that's the correct way to say it. Yep. A little harder to grasp, but yeah, if we want to do our spiritual side of things, that's exactly right. So
no,
what did I say here?
You've said before to me that consciousness is life.
Yeah, I thought that was in this outline somewhere. I haven't seen it yet, though. I was suggesting that you can't try to separate the two, and you can't do it, right? You can't find anything with life that doesn't have consciousness. Right? As hard as you think about it, and hopefully people are hearing this, heard my podcast on viruses, which aren't what people say they are. But yeah, it's life and consciousness are effectively synonymous, because you can't have one without the other. So that's it.
And did you want to say more on this self-awareness point that's right?
Yeah. Right. So, this in the materialist world, in the mainstream psychology, the way they differentiate humans from the animal kingdom, as a general rule, is they say that humans have self-awareness. So in other words, that you can be aware of this body that you call me, right? Whereas other animals can't really do that. To some degree, like chimpanzees and dolphins, and to some degree, even a dog can kind of do that, but not really. They don't really do that, and they suggest that is what sets humans apart from the animal kingdom. This idea of self-awareness. But what they're really pointing to is this super consciousness, or this awareness that is aware of the consciousness, which is the body. But because the two words have merged together and they mean the same thing, you got to go through a lot of iterations to make that point. So that's the witness for God idea. It's the witnessing position I mentioned earlier. Neutral observation is what the witnessing position is. So you're watching two people stand in front of you and argue, and you got no dog in the fight, and you don't think one's right and one's wrong, and you're just watching it. That's this witnessing position.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make a little bit of sense?
Mm-hmm.
I did the in the world but not of it part. So an even bigger idea, this is probably the big idea for this podcast, is that awareness actually is the precursor to consciousness. Now that's, we're not going to get into the, I mean, we go way out there to talk about that, but that's what I'm going to suggest, is that the before consciousness was awareness. Any questions on that one? I think I cut some of that section
That is
out.
the question. That's the
Yeah.
question, right?
Right.
So I think what we've done so far is, we're not claiming that we've like perfectly, you know, defined and rationalized all this stuff or anything like that. But I think what we've achieved here is that we started off with, this dictionary definition. Yeah. That consciousness is the state of being conscious. It is awareness of one's own existence, sensations, thoughts, and surroundings. And we've pointed out how absolutely limited that is, and how it's like, well, what, right? And then, we've thrown a bunch of extra concepts into the mix, and we've pointed at things in reality. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here that you can start to look at and just have a, lovely reflection and on all this stuff, and dream about it, and you know see if you can observe these things happening in your life.
Yeah, and in order to stick with that materialist, this last section I just closed on here, right? That the materialist view, you just have to ignore tens of thousands of examples, stories, explanations
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
things like astral travel, out of body, the Indian yogi Turiya state, and perhaps even bigger than all of those combined are what people today call NDEs, or near death experiences. And there
Mm-hmm.
are just literally tens of thousands of stories out there, books, and I think there was even a credentialed Harvard guy that put his reputation on the line, and obviously lost a lot of it because he went out to chase down these NDEs. And you read some of these stories, and they are astonishing. That they cannot be explained in any other way than, not all of them, but a lot of them can't be explained in any other way than this person was telling the truth, and they got into this Turiya state and saw and heard things that they shouldn't have been able to see or hear, because they were on the operating table, or their heart stopped beating, or whatever the case was. And to just ignore those things or hand wave them away, that's willful ignorance right there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a lot of respect for people who put themselves into that space. We got to ignore it. We can't explain it. Doesn't make any sense. Therefore, we're going to ignore it. But that's what they've done. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're left with. Those are your options. You can go with the materialist view and ignore 5,000-year-old wisdom that that's still active today in the spiritual circles, and tens of thousands of stories of people that say they can astral travel, say they can do out of bodies, say they've had a near-death experience, and you can ignore all of that. Then you could stick with the materialist explanation, which in my mind isn't much of an explanation. It doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so this has been a good discussion so far. We do have more content that we want to say, so we're going to call what we've done here part one. Some things we want to discuss in part two. We want to look at different levels of consciousness. For example, we want to explore this map of consciousness from David Hawkins. It goes from 0 to 1,000. That's super interesting. We also want to take a look at these concepts, conscience, like the difference between conscience and consciousness. So there's a lot more to cover. I think we can also look at things like how to become more conscious, and if that's a real thing, and if there's any value to it or anything like that, and what it involves and what it feels like. Anything you want to add to conclude, Brett?
No, I think that's an excellent place to wrap up this podcast, and we'll dive in a little bit deeper and wrap up with the topics you just mentioned
Okay.
on our next podcast.
Well, I think in that case, we could mention all of our products that we have on the mindblownzone.com. If you go there and go to products, you'll see all the three. Presently, we have 3 products, and there'll be more. But all of the training courses that we have are about, they're rooted in the idea that uh, let's say that health and having a better experience of life is so far governed and taught by materialists, right? For example, we have a back pain one. That's about how they're telling you to do physical material exercises and treat your body as this material thing and try to alter the body, right? Then we have one on weight loss. It's called conscious eating. And that's about how the material scientific worldview of weight loss is that it's all about this calories in, calories out, and you have to manage this scientific equation, and you have to repress cravings and eat these good foods and not eat these bad foods and manage how much you eat, right? Whereas our thing is like, you have to look up here. Yeah, you have to look inside, rather. You have to look at your beliefs. You have to engage with your consciousness. And that's how you lose weight. And if you watch the video that explains it takes you deep into that. Then we have Take Your Power Back. And that's that, out there in the external, in the whole political realm, like just the society, let's say. The view of that, the material is that we have to go do something to the external, right? We have to change who's in charge. We have to make these modifications to how government works, like do. But in Take Your Power Back, you internally take your power back. And as we all do that collectively, one by one, and it spreads out to more people. And now the internal experience of everybody changes. We're going to watch the external change basically automatically. You want to add anything to all of that, Brad?
I would just say that, Take Your Power Back really at its core is all about lifting your level of consciousness to far greater heights than most people are at today.
Sure. Absolutely. That is the major benefit.
Lots of good things follow. Cool. All right.
Did you want to mention this closing remark that you had right down the bottom?
I think we'll do that at the end of the part 2.
Okay. Well, tune in next time for the Brad's closing remark at the end of part 2.
Brad's,
you gotta wait for
that's
it.
The teaser. You got to wait for Brad's closing remarks.
Brad's gonna say a remark at the end of the next hour.
All right, cool. Well, hey, thanks everybody for listening, and thanks Matt for joining me on this podcast. And we will catch you all on the next one, part 2, consciousness.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.